we are.
You can see us?
Well, on Dawdlers.
Oh, baby.
God. Ridiculous.
Dropped frame 0. Look out.
Frame 0, is that the picture?
Yeah. I was saying dropped 0, which means it's smooth.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to hear. I'm sure I'll do, my computer and I will do our best to fuck up, you know?
Yeah. We're going to talk about the intellectual dark web. Isn't that exciting?
Yep.
Throwing
Sure
a little
is.
Rick Sanchez over there.
What?
All right, we're here, we're live. Hello,
Okay.
world.
Back to the turn of the wheel. Okay.
Okay.
We never announce who we are in this shit.
Who are you?
I'm Ryan Double Pandemic McKenna. Who the fuck are you?
I'm Harland Maskless Grant.
And we're
And
the
this is Dawdler's
Dawdlers.
Philosophy Podcast Live.
Shorts! Oh shit. Wrong one.
Who knows how long we'll talk about this tonight? We might just get rolling.
Let's get rolling. Although we're rolling really good right now.
So, we've talked about this before on the podcast, right? It comes up from time to time.
Does.
This group, cabal, conspiracy, that calls themselves the intellectual dark web. And we wanted to do an entire episode on it, right? So I think it can be thanks to you that we found a short book-length treatment of that group. And we're like, well, that'll be a thing we could do. Let's read this book. And so we read I forgot what it's even called now. The Michael Brooks Against the Web.
Yes. Michael Brooks, and he's got it's a YouTuber, I guess. And he is on a show, The Majority Report, with Sam Cedar. He co-hosts it in a way, right? And then they're part of the Young Turks family or whatever, the network. Or don't worry, Harland. One day we'll have a Dawdler's Philosophy Network.
Thank God.
Anyway.
It sounds like
so,
a nice contradiction in
yeah. And so anyway, and he has his own YouTube / podcast. It's just his name or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote this book published by Zero Books, which is I don't know how well known Zero Books is, but it's sort of famous for having published, I think, some of the Mark Fisher stuff, and then also a book by, the name is escaping me. She's Irish. Jesus, this always happens. Anyway, it's called Kill All Normies. What's her
Andrea
name?
Nagel?
Angela Nagel, yes. So anyway,
and the guy behind that, Douglas Lane, also is another internet celebrity podcaster intellectual type guy.
Yes. So anyway, so that's the whole the all the various nodes in a larger media leftist network, perhaps. And so anyway, that's where Michael Brooks fits in, I guess. And he wrote a book on the intellectual dark web, who are more or less his intellectual enemies or whatever, right? Politically, at
Yes.
least.
Yep.
And so that's sort of the background for the book. If anyone is totally unclear or unfamiliar with this territory, I doubt that there is unfamiliar with like the intellectual dark web or whatever, because of Sam Harris, the name brand recognition, Joe Rogan, all that shit. It's so much more over the top compared to, I think, the crowd that Michael Brooks is running with. So yeah, so we read that book, but we read the book with the idea in mind that I think we read the book with the thought that it would be like, oh, we're going to learn all this stuff about the intellectual dark web that we didn't even know or whatever, right? There's going to be some like expose, but really it's just, in my view, Michael Brooks just having problems, strong, deep-seated problems with Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, and Ben Shapiro in particular, right?
Yep. The short
And it,
book has a chapter on each of those three, and that makes up the bulk of the 100 pages or whatever it is.
yeah, it's not a long book. He's good to mention, at least at one point in the book, that like the whole IDW thing, the window of that, thing may have passed. The zeitgeist is over or whatever it is. But I don't know if that's actually the case now, because the two people who he doesn't really think are important, who we think are probably the most important part of the damn thing, the Weinstein brothers, they seem to be having a very strong showing in this IDW thing. And in a way, you'd almost think that if there's multiple phases to some, I don't know, you call it like a media movement, kind of like the New Atheists or whatever. I don't know what to call this kind of thing. I would not call it an intellectual movement myself, but uh, but this media movement, this might be a second phase or whatever, and they don't talk about IDW as much. But some people have fallen by the wayside. The Weinstein brothers, Bret's having his Tucker Carlson, and he's having his thing, right? So he's having a big moment now. The other guys, fucking Peterson is in a coma, and Dave Rubin's on the outs, and Joe seems to have just moved on. And fucking Ben Shapiro, he got laughed out because of that BBC interview. It's all very gossipy. And then what was the other thing? Who's the other guy? Oh, Harris. I just don't see much of Harris anymore, I guess. He was there for a little bit when he was getting in trouble with one of the things that Brooks talks about, which is the Charles Murray bell curve, IQ, racism stuff. But beyond that, I don't know. He seems to have moved on to his like meditation shit, right?
Well, I don't know. It just depends on how YouTube has pegged you in their algorithm,
Yeah.
what you see.
That's true.
Because,
That's
yeah,
true.
Harris is
Damn
out
it.
there going on the Weinstein, lest they hear this and need to correct you, Brothers podcasts. They all just kind of go on each other's shows and support one another.
Mm-hmm.
And rail against, the end of the world that's coming here because other people like to change genders and worry about race and stuff, and they don't necessarily like that. And cancel people, get them fired,
Ugh.
chase them off campus, hunt them down in cars.
God. Let me shed a tear for Pinker. All right. Who's being canceled but not canceled right now or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I
Okay.
think we should get to people like Pinker and Jonathan Haidt and those types later. Because at least the way my brain does it, I have different classifications, like sub-classifications within these two opposing and warring sides.
Yes. Do Harlan's brain, Harlan's body. Do it.
Brooks's thesis is
Oh,
this. I'm primarily interested in a broader and more important project. I want to understand the new right. It will continue to hide its conservatism, branding themselves as unclassifiable renegades, even as they share elements of an unmistakable anti-left agenda. They all defend the capitalist economic order domestically and American imperial hegemony globally. The IDW promotes narratives that either naturalize or mythologize historically contingent power relations. They are old school reactionaries. So, you know how they've all adopted Petersonian vernacular and talk about the postmodern neo-Marxists as the IDW's nominal enemy. Brooks is an avowed Marxist that he specifies many times in this book, not calling names that he didn't claim himself. But he's not an SJW type. And Brooks also says a few things that are anti that, like he doesn't like cancel culture, various things like that, right? So he's kind of separating himself out from that new woke left. But then he wants to call the IDW the new right, and that they are very reactionary and, you know, in this spatial metaphor that we're all stuck with of this supposed political gradient, that they are quote unquote on the right. Though the IDW people, if you ask them, many of them, including both Weinsteins and Harris, at least among others, they would say they're on the left. And we're progressives. They just don't like the woke culture. I don't even know what all of this vocabulary right now seems to be evolving. And we've got different people. Some people say the words and claim them themselves. Others attribute them to folks and try to make it stick. And it's a pejorative. Yeah. And I can't always tell which parts are which. Like social justice warrior, for example. I think that social justice, and maybe they would call themselves social justice advocates or something. Activists, part of it is legitimate, and then part of it's kind of a bad faith tack on insult. And I think that applies over many of these terms right now. So if I'm fucking any of them up, it's out of ignorance. I'm not attempting to insult people or belittle any of the positions with the vocabulary. If I'm going to belittle a position, it'll hopefully be by just saying an argument. Anyway.
Correct. Yeah, no, we have covered this to a degree in the past, you know. And so, for sure. Continue.
Where am I going next? Yeah, it was interesting and frustrating to me also that the IDW core is Bret and Eric Weinstein. And that Brooks thinks almost, they're mentioned twice. Once in chapter 1 when he just characterizes them as the bland Weinstein Brothers. Yeah. And then later on in the end of the Shapiro chapter, kind of as a throwaway. But he doesn't deal with them at all. And I think that's a bullshit move. Because I also think that the Weinsteins are some of the more intellectually interesting folks in the IDW. And that if you want to write and publish a book about it, you have to deal with those two. And it's just a total cheat not to.
Well, it's definitely a missed opportunity, but I'm not quite sure the thing about Peterson and Harris and Shapiro is that they give themselves too much rope to hang themselves with or whatever, right? So there's a lot of that which I think is fodder for their enemies or whatever. Whereas, and we'll talk about this maybe a little bit later when we talk about the Weinsteins. Um, they peddle in much more vague terms to me. Things are a little bit more vague, but you've been like watching them very closely these days, so I don't know, maybe they don't. But my experience with their vocabulary and their language is it tends to have a sort of vagueness. Not that Peterson doesn't either, but there, and that's another hallmark to me of the IDW. But someone like Harris can be very explicit, and he gets himself caught in lots of controversies. I just think that the framework that Brooks uses that you talked about earlier as part of his thesis is that they try and naturalize and mythologize certain political and cultural changes or whatever, and he's like, no, I'm going to historicize them, or whatever, which just plays to the Marxism, historical materialism or whatever type thing.
And I personally like that move. And I think that's a fair charge for many of the IDW types. That especially Peterson is the paradigm case, of course, of naturalizing hierarchy. He explicitly says that over and over, and we've got the lobsters and blah, 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 blah.
Yep.
And when they're not claiming that it's natural, they often are claiming that it is desirable. That maybe it's not in nature, but it's in the American spirit or something or in capitalism or somewhere, that this really works well if we have competition and all these. And I agree with his characterization that they all support capitalism. I think I haven't heard any of them not. And a lot about whether we should say the current order or maybe the 20th century order of America. They like that and want to keep it.
Yeah, there's definitely we need to go back and start again from a certain point, rewind the tape to a point and then, make sure we don't get too politically correct or get all caught up in things. And I think in particular, in terms of capitalism, in terms of a capitalistic ideology, he talks about they're all neoliberals or whatever, and that's sort of maybe a uniting part of them, and why they celebrate, like, I'm on the left and you're on the right, Ben Shapiro, and we can have a conversation. It's because they agree on, they have the same kind of capitalistic ideology or whatever, and in that way they can agree with each other. And so that seems to me like part of that. But anyway,
one of the things they would call a fundamentally uniting feature, they would label as free speech, right?
Yeah, that's another big one for them. Well, that's the big one, right? Free speech warriors.
I think
derogatory. So. Yeah.
Do you? I don't know if you have a comment about this. What would the quote unquote other side? What would the social justice brigade say about that issue if phrased that way? How do you feel about freedom of speech?
Well, what they're saying right now is, because it seems to me like people like Pinker, IDW people, and others, they're saying, this is cancel culture. And that, I think cancel culture is a direct line towards cutting off someone's ability to communicate and do whatever the rights are for free speech, etc. And the response, I think, from the more social justice activists or advocates or whatever is, you guys can't handle any kind of criticism. So that's what the way it's being couched right now, as I see it, is it's like, we're just criticizing, you're so sensitive, and everybody's calling everybody a snowflake, basically, I think is what it comes down to.
Oh, okay. I haven't heard or thought about it in that way. that they are coming back at these. Well, maybe I have white fragility, right? That's like you
Yeah.
white men are snowflakes. Okay, sure.
But in general, like, yeah, like, it's not just, well, whatever. Let's continue. But
You're so
that was
into
what
this
my,
topic.
no, I just thought maybe you're going to talk about specific things in the book.
Okay, more
And,
specific things from
and
the book.
so,
Okay, so
well, I
as I
just wasn't
was,
sure.
yeah,
I
yeah.
wasn't sure if you wanted to, that's all. And so
Oh,
I
well, I
was
mean,
like,
I highlight, so I've got all kinds of shit I can read off. Just to kind of reinforce with textual quotations things that we've sort of already said. Brooks says we should reject both traditional hierarchies and ultra woke scolding. So he's setting himself, he wants to make at least a triangle out of this. What he does
Mhm.
want is to move toward an equitable, compassionate, truly global socialist future. This book is best understood as an act of historicizing, as you stressed. I actually really like the sound of Brooks's parts of the sound of his politics, including when he wrote this. I was like, wow, that sounds awesome. I don't hear people say that very much. Okay. Quote, the impulse behind left-wing politics is the desire to create a world in which our lives aren't dominated by economic concerns, where people have free time and energy to explore, to meditate, to read novels, or try their hand at writing them, to pursue meaningful relationships because they're free from workplace tyranny that leaves them too exhausted at the end of the day, but to do anything than watch Netflix.
Yeah, I
That
like that
paragraph
too.
is fucking great. And I
Yeah,
like Brooks for that.
yeah, sure.
And that sounds good. I'm in support.
Yeah, I like that part of it. He also mentioned something at one point, and I don't have the quote in front of me, but something about like using humor as well. Like we shouldn't take ourselves so seriously, and that part I also like. Um, is laughing at yourself, and right now that's just like that never happens. Um, and so
Except on the Dawdlers.
I know we should be wearing clown makeup, except that would be creepy. So we don't.
Maybe we'd get some more hits anyways.
It's true from fucking wrong people though, probably.
So, okay. I like, that's the, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. That's what I can say nice about Brooks. Almost everything else I have to say about him/this book is bad. Because to me, what it felt like was, well, I've got a connection in the publishing industry. He even writes in here that, oh, my buddy, the editor of this book, wanted me to publish something. It feels like he went back through some past blog posts that he'd already written about Harris, Peterson, and Shapiro, put in a little bit of stucco between them, and all of a sudden he's got a book.
Yeah.
It
Well,
is smarmy and snarky and bitchy and gossipy, unintellectual, dumbing down. It's uncharitable. It's unfair. It talks about stuff. It's a book about the IDW, says the cover. And then, for example, in the Harris chapter, it's all about Harris debating Noam Chomsky over email
I know.
about Islam and bombing and terrorism and all this stuff. And I'm like, that has nothing to do with the IDW's current 2020 crusade. This book was also published in 2020. It's
And that
so,
almost seems like it was before the IDW. If
yeah.
I don't know, it seemed like it was one of those things that Harris was, because that was before this whole IDW thing. It was like, maybe even while Obama was president or something, even
Mm-hmm.
when he was having that. And he's like, and I'm going to
Oh, yeah, it's
post the
way back.
email exchange. And it's just like, Jesus Christ. Oh, yeah,
Now,
way
that
back.
was
That was
also
the other thing.
ridiculous. And I think Harris looked like an ass during that. And I'm not intending to defend the IDW or Harris when I say that's a bullshit move by Brooks to, dredge up that, which is, I think, mostly irrelevant to the IDW. He's just like, yeah, well, one of the guys in the IDW had this stupid thing happen 10 years ago or whatever. Okay, I don't care.
Sure. Yeah, of course. And that was sort of the disappointing part to me, was that I was like, yeah, but what about, like, it was, I don't remember what the number of the episode was in our podcast, but it was the one that was talking about, like, sort of, it was hustling past the graveyard, I think is what it called it. But that one, I mean, what I was looking for was just, to see if there was anything like the sort of conspiracy type stuff, because of, like, associations that some of these members of the IDW have with various other parts of the culture, and it was more like punditry, like Tucker Carlson, than it was like, investigative journalism or whatever, where the person was, like, going through and following the money and, or whatever. And I was thinking maybe there'd be a little bit of that, not necessarily following the money, but just, more of a, who are these people and what's going on, like that. But it seemed like he had already made up his mind, and he was going to, take Ruben out first and be like, hey, look at this idiot, and then finally, like, parade out the others.
Man.
So it's, yeah.
That stuff was really frustrating to me. Maybe I didn't even bother to highlight it. But there's just all this ad hominem cheap attacks or whatever. An ignorant charlatan like Jordan Peterson, he says something about
yeah.
Dave Rubin is dumb as a rock. No, wait, he's dumber than a rock is, or whatever. And I'm just like, this is not worthy of publication. Maybe at most, if you're kind of a jerk in the first place, you say it on a podcast live because it just comes out. But that you choose to write that in your book, to me, the medium warrants elevation beyond the way he talks.
Purist.
Yes, but there's major differences between, and this can be a future episode or something, I think, between doing humanity's best approximation of eternalizing, codifying in texts worthy of preservation, and the ephemerality of gossip level internet. Yeah, here's two idiots streaming for hours, like, so many, there's more hours of content created than the entire of YouTube viewers will ever watch, and all this stuff.
Current events. Yeah.
The ephemeral media don't need to approximate accuracy of views and precision of language that books do, because they're meant to last, and they're meant to be referenced by those of us generations later. They're time binding.
Oh God, not this thing again. I can't handle it. Oh.
Anyway, you're like, shut up. That's not about the IDW either.
I'm not going into that one.
All right. Do you want to talk about either the Harris Chomsky thing, the way Brooks treats Harris, or anything else about Harris?
I mean, the only thing I would say is that, well, no, not
no.
No, not especially. No, not that particular part. Carry on to the next thing,
or
that
Peterson or whatever. Or what do you
want
to do?
All I was thinking was, like, in terms of the naturalizing, the idea that, people of a certain race are dumber than others or whatever, and that's that's sort of a naturalizing thing. They're trying to say, like, well, they're just not as smart as us and they never will be. And, that's sort of an example, I think, of that, where Harris was, bringing people like Charles Murray onto his podcast, and there was a lot of controversy, and Harris just can't let something like that go. And so then he has like Ezra Klein on, right, and all that kind of stuff, and that was also talked about in the book. And so, but that is the part that I think is more the naturalizing. I don't know how much mythologizing Harris does of stuff like that. And then and it would be really great for me to say, and this is how Brooks historicized it, but I don't remember. So, but like in general, like, the idea is that, of course we talked about the hierarchies and the lobster and all that shit with Peterson. That's sort of naturalizing. And Peterson does a bit of the mythologizing, I believe, which is that he uses sort of the Carl Jung style of, there's these, great, what does he call them? Not myths, but there's some kind of background that, we all
Archetypes?
operate. Yeah, he loves the archetype thing, like in that we're just sort of, I don't even know about the specific details of the archetype thing, but I know he mentions it an awful lot. It seems pretty vague to me. Maybe it's sort of Plato, the Plato's cave type allegory thing. I don't know, but it just has this quality um, of like early to mid 20th century or late 19th century psychology, of sorts, where there's a little element of almost not supernatural per se, but just sort of like something you can't quite grasp, but it's there anyway, And those seem to be these moves that they want to make when they mythologize and when they naturalize. Whereas if you historicize something, as I'm trying to understand what that means in particular in this very moment, but if it was me thinking, oh, well, how do you historicize something? Then you just kind of go back and you say, well, these are the more explicit moves people made to exclude others and to, use people or whatever. And here's the sort of historical, I don't want to say accident, but the historical, reasons for, why it, things are the way they are today or whatever. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think there's at least two major ways to run a historicist project, and one of them is the sort of Nietzschean version that he called a genealogy,
Yeah, the
where we
genealogy.
say, where did this come from?
Yep.
I mean, and maybe I was saying that there are two, but it's just different ways to describe the same thing. I don't know. And the other one is sort of just providing a context. Well, what's the question as of now, and then what is the history of that thing? I mean, I guess I was
Right.
thinking of it in terms of the genealogy thing as sort of what are the external conditions that come in to form a concept, institution, organism, whatever, and an
Mhm.
internal version that shows what did this thing do throughout its own history.
Yeah.
An ecological historicism or an individualist or something. I don't know.
Right. But anyway, that's sort of the main thrust, which again, I don't mind the historical analysis of these things, but I do kind of, I don't know. There is something, I don't want to get away from the idea that there isn't something natural about the way we behave. That like it's not the history of chimps, it's a chimpiness, or whatever that we exhibit, that biologists, for instance, or the field of biology suggests has been molded over time based on external conditions and the fit between an organism and its environment or whatever. Like I don't want to get away from that also being part of the picture. And so to me, I don't know where he left off with that. If he even acknowledged that there is something natural about it, or if he just wants to do only this historical socialist, analysis of the situation to rebuke anything natural or mythological, because I think mythology also seems to play to an extent a role in how people think. They just may not realize that the myth is something that they just like the American dream or whatever, or there was something, I can't remember what it was in Roman times. I can't remember what it was called, but there was something like that then too. It was just kind of trying to like harken back in an anachronistic way to like a golden age or whatever, something that you think is sort of almost eternal, and I think that that also has an influence on people too, but I don't know. Maybe I'm off about all of that.
Well, I don't know if this is precisely what you were saying, but here's something that I think is related. You can
Mhm.
mythologize without fetishizing. You can
Mhm.
do, like, I'm a really big fan of detachment. And I think that is under discussed and appreciated in our time. There's a lot that can be gained from doing your best. Of course, you can't totally escape bias and you're going to make mistakes. But at least to value it and strive for a kind of intellectual detachment when talking about everything. And just like comedians should be able to joke about everything, intellectuals should be able to think about or consider or argue about anything. And scientists should be able
I
to
like that.
test anything. We shouldn't be afraid
Mhm.
to say, maybe there is an intellectual difference between the races. If
Mhm.
a scientist can do their job right and define their terms and design an experiment and run it and whatever. I think one of the problems they would run into is that at this point in time, I don't believe in race. I'm kind
Yeah.
of on the bus, and maybe you can straighten me out, or maybe it'll have to be the comments section. But I think there's a lot to the little meme level bumper sticker. Race isn't real, but racism is. That
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that makes a lot of sense.
I think that there's I don't know. Like I know that it's obviously always very contentious and all that to discuss this stuff, but um I think there are differences in populations based on where you're from. So if you're, a population in Central Asia versus a population in like say, a Native American population of sorts in Colombia or something like that. Like you're likely to have had some differences in how you've, developed and evolved and everything. And to the extent that I understand it, there's a guy, Alan, shit. I'm always good at this. I know the name Joe Rogan, and he was apparently recently on Joe Rogan's podcast. And Joe Rogan said something to the effect of, um, black women have denser bones than white women, or something like that. And the guy was uncomfortable about that. So he just kind of let it go by. And then afterwards, when they were done, he was like, "What the hell are you talking about with that?" Because I'm kind of like, what do you mean, Joe? Like, and Joe was like, "Yeah, it's research into the physics of bones and whatnot. That you know black people have denser bones or whatever than white people." But then when you look into it even further, they start to talk about really kind of talking about populations of various um, you know uh, regions where people might be from and stuff. And the main thing that is concern is like when people get older and they fall down and they break their hip, and so that isn't uncommon for in science, medical researchers to try and control for various different parts. So they'll control for, they'll have women and men in one group and all that kind of stuff, or they'll at least account for these various um, metadata or whatever. And then race will be one of those things as well. Um, and then they just in general, like maybe they can also break it down in terms of like, are you undersized, or or are you over, are people like oversized? We could talk about all different kinds of things. And so yeah, that was an instance where it looks like there's quite a bit of research into uh you know the way that bones age or whatever. And the explanation for, at least, well, I don't even think it's a very good explanation at this point, because when I looked further into it, it looked like, even though I don't know if Asians have dense bones as well, like East Asian people, They don't tend to have as much hip fractures or whatever either. And like Mexicans don't either, like people of more Mexican descent or whatever. So it's like, I don't know. But white people are in trouble basically because they break their bones all the time and they're brittle. It's the white fragility. Anyway, so that's sort of like, these are the kinds of things you can ask, but you know, it's, if you let, like you were saying, all of your emotions and everything and all the cultural milieu fall into that, then you're never really going to be able to make heads or tails of anything, whether to say, you know what, I think it's all bullshit because, you know, so you've got black skin and you're an Australian Aborigine, or you're from the Andaman Islands, or you're from Uganda, you know, like these people are all going to have very, very different, you know, like population histories, and have separated out quite a while ago. And, you know, I don't know. It's just that kind of stuff. And also people in Africa, populations within Africa are genetically very distinct from one another. So some of them are even more distinct from each other than, say, we are from them, you know, or whatever. So
Okay. So now you're coming back around to saying things that I'm more in agreement with or comfortable with or whatever. Because one thing that I wanted to ask was, would I be wrong to say that black or white are not scientific terms? Those are...
I don't.
Yeah. Aren't those just kind of high-level, gross generalization terms from individual idiot humans walking around looking at skin color? It's not...
I suppose. I know people want to... Some people want to be called something, and so some people, you know, who are, you know, of more recent ancestry to Africa would say they would like to be called black, and they say they don't want to be called African American or whatever. Like, you know, so I don't know. It's not something like, I know this is like falls right into that white fragility book, but it really isn't something that I personally think about. And I don't know how I would break it down in terms of like scientifically. I know people do, but they tend to say like, you know, non-white Hispanic or whatever, you know, like all that kind of shit. So I don't know. They have their own ways of doing it that I've just never really participated in any kind of study where it was broken down like that. I've just read them, and of course I don't remember all the details. I don't think they say black. I think they say African American or whatever or something. I don't know.
Maybe the way to phrase my point is those terms belong in demography, not genetics. Is that a better way?
I almost think maybe they belong in anthropology rather than even demography. Because demography primarily is just going to be talking about age groups as well. Like, you know, just, you know, how many people in these different age groups do you have? And it really wouldn't necessarily matter always what, you know, what part of a culture you're in.
Well, yeah, they can measure along different dimensions.
Yeah.
Age being one.
I don't, yeah, whatever. I mean, I don't know. Demography uses a lot of stuff that's like biological. So it's, I don't know. A lot of the same tools are used, you know, between like people who studied life history and people who studied demography, you know, more or less the same idea. Except we just, when it comes to people, we get really special. So we have like epidemiology and demography, you know, it's just like, okay. That's how I feel about it. But there's a total equivalent, it seems to me, in the other side. You know, they call it like population biology, or because they're going to talk about spiders and deer and fucking seagrasses. Or, you know what I mean? Like, it's just like they get really specific when it comes to humans, it seems. I'm sure there are differences that have developed over time that one might be able to say, yeah, this is why we have it this way, but I don't know.
To pull us out of this rabbit hole, which I think you're ready to do.
I am.
The thread that we were on before we got to that was I was saying I like detachment, and I think that intellectuals and scientists and whatever should be able to think about and experiment on whatever they want whatever. So that sounds good to me. Let's see, where was I going with that?
I know, because I was like, then I started to maybe start to do that, and you were like, "Whoa, sailor!" No.
I thought that I remembered where we were to go back to it, and then when I tried to do it, I realized I was mistaken.
I mean, we aren't the Dawdlers for a reason, right? I mean, or we are the Dawdlers for a reason. We are the Dawdlers for a reason.
Here's a question I had. To
Yeah,
not go back on any track, but to start a new one.
please do.
It bothers me that, well, to put it this way in human terms, because, it's easy for people to track and remember. There are many things that I like and respect about Eric Weinstein. It bothers me that he has some of the friends he has, that he defends some of the people he defends, that he invites and welcomes and keeps in his group some of the people he does. Ben Shapiro being one. I have no respect for that person's intelligence or character or anything.
Mm-hmm.
Does it or should it bother you about some group, the IDW, or about some person, Eric Weinstein as an individual, whatever, that they invite in other people that you think aren't so great?
No, it doesn't bother me. I don't really. I'm just like, whatever, But I feel similar to you about the Weinstein. What is it? God damn it!
Maybe this is the way to remember it. Eric said this on Joe Rogan once, I think. Nobody ever pronounces Einstein wrong. And of course, since since these people have healthy egos, he sees himself in that class and he's like, how dare you pronounce Weinstein wrong? Anyway.
Okay, well that's fine. It's just like a W in front of it, right? Um okay. So that is a terrible way to put it, actually. Okay. So what I like about this guy, Eric, in particular, is I just wrote it down. So anyway, um, he's smart and he's charming. He has a sense of charm to me, anyway. I think he's open. That's the thing. That's why he's got all these friends you don't like him or you don't like. And he's open to that kind of stuff, and I like that. Um, uh, he's interested slash interesting in that he's into music and math. This is me talking here. He seems very pro-social. He lives a somewhat kind of multicultural life. um all of that stuff is really good about him that I like. This is Eric. What I don't like, yeah, is his association with Peter Thiel. um and then his, like you were saying, his obsession, well, in my words, his obsession with like intra elite competition and just sort of the you know this whole thing about like Kanye call me, or whatever the fuck that shit is. Like I just what, like, I don't know. It's all probably part of his openness, but it seems a little, as my son would say, it's cringy. And
Yes,
I'm just
yes.
like, just don't do that, dude. Like, um, and so those are things I don't know how much you think about it. But
Well,
again,
they're
like we've
fucking
said,
cringy, all right.
Brooks,
And Bret's even worse on that score.
yeah, but like Michael Brooks, like we said already earlier in this discussion, uh, yeah, he didn't focus on these two guys, and I just think that these two are kind of as far as anything goes in the IDW, the Barry Weiss article or whatever you want to call it, they're kind of the real deal, you know. In terms of people, like there was a thing you did you send it to me, or I don't know how I fucking saw it, but it was the two of them talking just relatively recently or whatever, and I was like, you know, they've been doing this for years. Like they've been talking about stuff, and they probably have long phone call conversations with each other, you know, bicker and whatever it is. They had this, podcast episode. I think it was Bret's podcast or whatever. And I don't know. I don't dislike their general conversations. It's like I would say with Bret, one of the things that I I don't know if it's that I like about him, but he and I share a lot of premises. Where you go from there is like we have a very different um, way to do that or whatever. But it's not hard for me to like think if I was sitting there, I would be enjoying a conversation. I mean, eventually it would go off the rails and I'd start drinking harder. But yeah, that's what I'd say
Yeah,
about Eric.
I think I could have enjoyable conversations with most of these people. In italics, even Harris and Peterson. I could probably talk to them. Once you get to Shapiro or you're on Brooke or whatever, I have no interest.
Okay.
And then Harris and Peterson are like, I could attempt to yell at them for a while. Like, we'd have more disagreements. And then the Weinsteins are like, yeah, I'd like to talk to them. I mean, because you need to get at least close enough on certain things in order to have interesting disagreements. If you're too far apart, you've got plenty of disagreements, and most of them are boring. Right? And then you've got to go back to the foundations. And you're like, I've done this since college or whatever, with...
Yeah.
I don't want to argue about the existence of God and free will and whatever anymore. But then if you get somewhat close to people but still have interesting disagreements, of course, I still disagree with them about ultimately almost everything. But at least I think we could converse. Truth being the biggest, the epistemology stuff. They need a lot of work on that.
Well, Bret mostly to me, much more of a truth seeker, or truth seeking is the behavior he tends to do more often than it seems Eric to me. I don't know. Do you think they're just equal? I would say that Eric likes to play more games, but from what I see. But you have been on a binge. So you would know. You're the Dawdler expert, in-house expert on Weinsteins.
They both, I mean, yeah, whatever. I mean, who cares? And we're getting probably too gossipy. Bret's probably more dogmatic than Eric, but they both are way too dogmatic for me. Okay, so let's see. I don't know if there's a conversation to be had here. You disagree with me, at least at first on the surface, about guilt by association or whatever. Like, do we distrust Eric because he's friends with Ben or whatever? And I tend to do that because I think, what does that mean about you if you respect a moron? That bothers me about the first person. I'm like, okay, well, maybe, why can't you see this? Or why don't you spend your time arguing against that person instead of welcoming them into the fold?
Well, because I was saying that, like, some of the qualities about Eric that I like was that he's open and that he's pro-social. And so those are things that he might get some juice from having conversations with, someone like Ben Shapiro. Where I tend to have more of the issue is like, he's employed by a billionaire. It's like, so now I don't know, like he doesn't have to, do anything with Ben Shapiro. He owes him nothing, and Ben owes him nothing, but Peter Thiel, like, it's just, I don't know. That was part of my whole tongue-in-cheek conspiracy thing from back in that Hustling Past the Graveyard episode, where I just thought, what is this? Like, I mean, I get it. Maybe he's just trying to pay the bills and this is the best way he's figured out how and whatnot. And it provides him all these opportunities, which he's always wanted, because he's sort of a counter intellectual these days because he has no body of work that you can go and cite. I don't see any writing that these guys put together. Um, and yeah, I mean, that was the first thing I noticed. He talked about education in a way, this was a while back. He talked about education in a way I was like, wow, that's really great. So I wanted to go see if there was anything he'd written. I couldn't find anything. Like he was like off he was like you or me, except it was like he was doing an interview with Big Think, and I'm like, what's going on here, and to me, just that he would have friends in high places and yet have no like detectable like what am I trying to say, like internet history or something like that, where I can go and find him laying down thoughts on paper where you can go and really digest it. And he spends the time, like you were talking about, the where we should put books in our intellectual um, status levels or whatever, like I, that part bugged me, and that's what bugs me. I don't care that he's friends with Ben Shapiro. I care that his boss is Peter Thiel.
And
Like,
is the
it's like,
reason that you
what's
care
going
about
on?
that you suspect that will either bias him
Influence?
so that he has mistaken thoughts, or
No,
make him censor or project only certain messages that he knows will be acceptable by his master, or what?
both, both, I
Both?
suppose, or maybe, um, he's really into that stuff anyway. Maybe that is what he really values. Um, I'd rather be, I like that when he's all, extending an olive branch to people like Ben Shapiro or whatever. To me, that seems like that's a healthy thing to do, is to try and understand someone else's perspective, and to be able to like, you know, make friends with somebody who you completely disagree with, because that seems like a better environment to be in than a hostile one where everybody's just like, I fucking hate you. And, just that seems like a better world. Um, you don't have to fully agree with him, and you don't have to go to bed with him at night. You know what I mean? Like, he's just somebody, and maybe you've had some exchanges with him. It's not a fucking like commitment you're making or whatever. But with Peter Thiel, you are, you're managing his capital or whatever the fuck, his investment group or something like. I, I don't know. And also, I don't understand the title, managing director. Is that just one of those ones like something specialist? Like it all kind of just like, so there's a very human side to the guy, but then there's also this sort of mystery, and I don't know what the fuck's going on. And yeah, it's just sort of it. It's weird to me. So there's that. That's stuff that I really just don't like about him. Do you want to go
And I
on
guess
further about Eric?
what?
Nothing. Go ahead. You
Oh, I was
guess
just
what?
gonna. I don't know. I was still talking about this.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's bored. I was gonna say, to
Mm-mm.
me, I almost feel backward opposite to that, because of the way our society is structured. There are many heavy incentives to have bosses, and he gets all kinds of benefits from that relationship. But you don't necessarily get benefits from the sort of, peer to peer, or even reaching down and lifting someone up relationship of, yeah, I'm smarter and more famous than you or whatever, and I'm gonna like pull you up and help you or whatever, when the person you're helping is a piece of shit. That, is less understandable or whatever. Like, I can make more excuses for having a boss. But whatever,
Mm,
who cares? It's just a thing.
yeah.
This is all gossip level shit. Thanks, dawdlers.
Well, I was just saying, those are the reasons why I like and dislike the guy. I have the same kind of thing for Bret. I don't know if you have anything of like. Sounds like you don't like the gossip stuff. So do you have any content
Yeah,
about the wine? All right, Jesus Christ.
I've got some content. In fact, I'm pulling in another source. We're going to Donald Crosby's The Spectre of the Absurd. Sources
I gotta write this shit down.
criticisms of modern nihilism. Because the fresh content I want to provide is that Bret and Eric Weinstein have a tendency to be priestly in a sense that I think people like Nietzsche would call that they're like Christian nihilists, except that their God is science.
Okay.
So in the beginning of this book, this fellow Donald Crosby, who is a professor at University of Colorado or something like that,
That looks like an old book. So he's not. Is he alive even?
I don't know the answer to if he's alive or not. It's a 1988 publication, so it's not that old.
Oh, okay.
It's a little bit old. It's not 2020.
I know. I'm thinking of Michael Brooks when he was like, long before the IDW,
Yeah.
there was the new atheist. Children gathered round at the fire. Sorry.
Crosby begins the book by telling a story of a student who comes to his office. A freshman came to my office to talk about a paper he had failed to hand in on time. I was prepared for the usual excuses, but this student surprised me. He explained he had not been able to bring himself to write the paper on an aspect of Plato's philosophy because he was a Christian. As a Christian, he saw no point in studying the thought of someone, such as Plato, who was himself not a Christian and had no way of knowing about the Bible or its teachings, because he was firmly convinced that the Bible already contained all truth. Then Crosby goes on to kind of tell the kid about all the standard things, well, even Christians over the centuries have found lots of value, and we can enhance and give expression to our faith, and we want to let one's understanding outreach our convictions, and all these platitudes about education. And the student still wasn't satisfied. They came back with, yeah, okay, so you got these philosophy professors in universities that pretend to have no firm convictions of their own and take delight in questioning and criticizing everything in sight. Postmodernists. Students are left losing whatever convictions they had and are left with nothing and slide helplessly into relativism and skepticism, wallowing in a sea of options, none of which can understand critical doubt. This gives him a loss of what had formerly given structure and meaning to his life, erodes conviction, certitude, and leads to a collapse into a fatalistic despair. A bleak prospect of erosion and negation, a complete annihilation of objective truth and value. The specter of the absurd. And I remember talking about this way back in episode 6 or whatever about skepticism, and the same as with nihilism, that one finds in the rhetoric of consideration of opinions such as these entirely Stephen King style horror. Everything is about specters and ghosts and annihilation and despair and terror, and people talk about these positions or strategies or orientations or ideas with horror. And we need to first get past that before we even stress the arguments in their favor. But anyway, so I found that when I was reading that about this student, it's like, I don't even want to consider this entire body of literature, because I've already decided where the truth lies. It's in this book and this methodology, of revelation or whatever it is.
Uh-huh.
And to me, it appears that Bret and Eric Weinstein, among many others, feel that way about the Bible in the analogy is the canon of American 21st century academia or whatever. And the methodology in the analogy is revelation to, some kind of very basic scientific empiricism. And I think that both of them, this Christian student and these guys, are realists. It's just that one is a theological realist and one is a scientific realist. But they're both realists, and they both have very strong emotional level reactions against skepticism, nihilism, what they call mistakenly postmodernism, and attribute that frightening paradigm to the SJWs, and that's what motivates their absolutistic, tribal, warmongering, aggressive rhetoric against them. That there is a truth, there's a way to find it, we know what it is, it's called the scientific method. These people are anti-science, and they're endangering our way of life and our civilization, is how they set it up. And I think that I disagree with every premise of that. So that if that's what they're doing, no. It's not, but I'm also emphatically not coming from a place of Robin DiAngelo and social justice and whatever. I'm anti-justice, I'm anti-identity, I'm anti-racism, like all of that. Like, I'm not taking a dog in that fight. I'm saying that fight is just set up wrong, and both sides have different ways of being full of shit.
So again, just to be clear, the Weinsteins are the Christian student in this little anecdote by Donald Crosby. I keep wanting to say David Crosby or Bing. Right?
Yeah. And the reason that you would call that position the sort of Christian nihilist is that they set up a high stakes scenario where if our cherished dogmas were to be undermined, it's the end of the world, like the death of God or whatever. Like, if we lose our thing, that's the end of it. That's like a type of nihilism. Like, it's either this or everything is awful,
So how is that type of nihilism much different than, just like a microscopic or microcosm of Kuhn's crisis between two paradigms? Because we talked a little bit about that a little bit ago. You made mention of like, well, it doesn't have to always be crisis, right? And I'm like, well, but that's the model, because it was an analogy with revolution, political revolution. Scientific revolutions, he was talking about paradigms, and that there's always a crisis when principal parts of the paradigm A are being undermined by new things coming in from paradigm B. It sounds very similar to me, like when your dogmas or whatever you want to call it are being undermined in any particular way, then it is like an emotional uproar, and it's very difficult to maintain any kind of detachment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and that there is essentially like what seems like an existential crisis, even if it's intellectual. But I would imagine that for people such as ourselves and maybe the Weinsteins and others, that it's hard to not. I mean, we've invested so much of our lives in whatever intellectual pursuits that detachment can be very difficult, right? During these sort of undermining points.
I have
Perhaps
no
not for
idea.
you.
I must I think that I'm on the spectrum as far as that or whatever, because to me it seems to be easy to do most of the time. And I don't know why it has to be hard. And I figure detachment is probably hard if you have, whether it's all the way along the spectrum that you have a dogma or even that you quote unquote believe something. I guess I could see why that would be difficult. But if you, in the very first place, strive not to have beliefs and definitely don't claim to know anything, it's kind of hard to have that type of crisis. So I don't know what it feels like. I don't believe anything in the
I'm
first
guessing
place.
I'm guessing a lot of people do, and they don't necessarily. I don't mean to say this in a bad way, but they don't have that luxury, maybe, and maybe because of the culture, or because of various kinds of circumstances, whatever they may be,
Hmm.
that cause you to not have a problem switching tracks without an emotional response. Uh, I think the norm to me would be the emotional response, like the existential crisis or whatever you want to call it.
Probably. I'm just saying I can't speak to that so well because I don't feel a personal connection to that emotion. I have some
Right, but the
emotions.
like, yeah. But is that just a point you were just moving on to the next thing, or was that a point of discussion? The
I hope there
idea
to
that
be
it's the end of the
discussion,
world.
yeah.
So that's what I'm providing then is I think that this is one of those things where I just this is where I think sympathy and stuff comes into play, or even empathy or whatever you want to call it, where you feel like you get to walk a mile in someone's shoes. I know there's like Paul Bloom has a book called Against Empathy or whatever, and I haven't read it. I I'm I assume he's against empathy and is pro detachment or something like that. But at the same time, it's like, well, given these two individuals that we're discussing right now and this analysis from Donald Crosby's book, using his anecdote as sort of an analogy to kind of their response to challenges to their status quo or dogmas or whatever, that it's like, what are we supposed to do? Because um, to me, it seems like, well, for you, it seems perfectly natural that, I have to change my mind. I change my mind. To me, it seems perfectly natural that they would have that response, like, oh, it's the end of the world or whatever, that there's an investment, that they've made commitments to some set of principles or whatever it is, right? And I think it's like having a feel for the animal or whatever is just what keeps coming up to in my head is like, um, I'm not surprised that that's their that analogy you make to me sounds right, and that would be their response, which is that it's the end of the world or whatever. Um, because it's, well, maybe it's more than just the world; it's the end of their world, and they're, like I was mentioning earlier, kind of like counter intellectuals or counter elite intellectuals of sorts. So they haven't even had an opportunity to, like, I mean, Bret had his evergreen thing, but it's not like I think he went to the University of Chicago. He's not some bigwig guy down the hall from Jerry Coyne at the University of Chicago or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, so they're kind of on the outs a little bit. Um, Especially say Eric or whatever, who, one of the things I don't remember, you probably something you sent me, but he was saying something along the lines of how he didn't have an advisor. And I know that was sort of an egotistical pat on the back, but it was also sort of like a, who's going to look after me? Like, they don't want me in the academy or whatever, like. And so even just to have a taste of that and then it's now be taken away, to me that seems like, at least as an explanation of, or at least it's an attempt at an explanation of their motivations as to why they would respond the way they are. would you want to change their minds? And if so, would you incorporate the feel for the animal style thing into trying to get them there wherever?
Maybe that's one of my problems, is that I don't have a feel for the animal. I don't really want to. I want the rest of you to stop being animals.
Oh, Matrix.
And there's some amount of, I think, vicious hypocrisy going on, though sometimes hypocritical accusations of hypocrisy, other than hypocritical accusation, are unwarranted. It can be fine, but I don't think they would say what you're saying.
For what reason?
For the reason. Bret thinks that he is a very, very reasonable, rational, enlightenment individual. I'm not just an animal that believes it because I can't help it. Like, he wouldn't say that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was that, but I would say maybe, like we've mentioned ego. I think ego takes a large part in a lot of this. It's like, how does one see themselves? Let me tell you real quick what I was thinking about with Bret. Again, smart. He and I share a lot of premises. I think that at times he can be endearing. And the other thing I like about him is that he has ideas. Like sometimes I don't know, like what are Ben Shapiro's ideas? He seems to just like be a reactionary. You know what I mean? Like among these IDW people. And then what I don't like is that he's incredibly vague at times, especially when he starts to go from whatever premises I'm trying to like, oh yeah, I think I know what you're saying. And then he starts to head out from there to like whatever kind of ideas or conclusions that he has. They can be very vague to me. Not always, but a lot of them tend to be. And I think he's an ultra Darwinian. That's another thing entirely. But I think if he would have deemed somebody less established, I know this is kind of gossipy, but this is part of the feel for the animal thing. I think he would talk down to you. You know what I mean? Like if you didn't think you were on his level or whatever, like
I agree.
he would assume the position of the expert and tell you the way it is. To me, that's ego. To me, that's all like if someone's challenging your, opportunities or whatever it is, it's the whole I'm not going to bake you a cake. It's like, fuck you. What about my resources? What about my opportunities? I'm an expert. I got things to say. To me, that seems like as much of a motivating factor or reason for why there would be this reaction, of like, it's the end of my world or the world. The world sounds better because now, you don't realize that you're going to get it too. That often also seems to be the thing that's said. Evergreen was just the beginning, and now it's everywhere, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, did I?
Can you remind what in that would be most appropriate for me to address, if anything?
Well, I was just thinking it's just like what was the reason for why they would be in a crisis, and you were like, well, they would say that it's the reason or whatever, that they're rational animals and stuff like that. And I would say, well, that's just underneath that. To me, it seems like it's more like ego and a sense of personal failure and triumph and all that kind of stuff. To me, it seems very personalized, and it seems very explicitly personalized, especially for someone like Bret because of his story with Evergreen and all that, and the idea that his life was taken away from him for whatever, all that kind of stuff. You can move on to another thing too if you want.
Oh, well, one thing that I did want to briefly say, it's probably not what you want me to talk about. We need to do an episode on structure of scientific revolutions. But I think that the crisis doesn't come from conflict with another paradigm. The crisis comes from anomalous data within a paradigm, right? That's
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Sure. Yes. Like if I slipped up in that, or to me, it's like it's already mapped out in my head,
Mm-hmm.
the model as a whole, so that's all I was, yeah. But it doesn't have to be, because he does talk about things as if they were multiple paradigms, because he talks about how one group or paradigm or whatever constantly questions the foundations of the other, and that kind of stuff often happens too. I don't know. We can read that one and look at it again. I've been reading it recently.
Yeah. One thing that I think that these guys have, to hit the Crosby one more time, is that he gives Tertullian's definition of faith, which is this, way old-timey, like 200 AD churchy guy. The entertainment of philosophical questions leads inevitably to heresy. Only acceptance of the authority of the Christian (brackets scientific) teaching can give respite from an endless round of futile searching and questioning, and that to know nothing in opposition to the rule of faith (brackets science) is to know all things. That's how Bret Weinstein especially comes off to me. If anyone's out there and listening and wants to do research, I'm mostly referencing his diatribes in Dark Horse Live number 22, which you can find on YouTube. He and Heather Hying, his wife that they co-host the podcast with, go through and really let the dogmatic flag fly in that one. And they go so deep into, there is a truth and a reality, and I know what it is, and you fuckers don't, and science is the only way, and you got to do science, or blah, blah, blah. And it just sounds so Tertullian to me, and faith-based, and I don't like it. They need to stop that. They are afraid of this boogeyman, and they put all the horror terminology to it, of skepticism / postmodernism. And then, since that's what has been mistakenly attributed to SJWs, then that's all part of it. So that we could talk about that briefly if you care at all. You're probably like, let's go, let's get off this.
No, let's
I totally agree with Thaddeus Russell about this, who's another podcast host, formerly teacher, whatever. He taught postmodern stuff, whatever. And he keeps trying to tell these folks, identity politics is not only not postmodern, it is antithetical to postmodernism. One of the major points of this postmodern perspective, to the extent it even exists, I don't think that's really like the IDW, where they're like, okay, we got our little group, and here's Foucault and Lyotard and Derrida, and we're all postmodernists now, right? And I don't think they even did that. I think it's been subsequently developed and then retroactively applied, and probably filters some interpretations of their works. Nevertheless, I think that most of those guys would be saying, no. One of our whole points is that there is no identity, and there's no grand historical narrative, and there's no, that's one of the reasons why it is oxymoronic to say postmodern Marxist, because Marxism loves grand historical narratives, and postmodernism is anti-historical narrative. But anyway, I think that postmodernism is quite clearly anti-identity. And then this whole new movement that they're fighting against is all about assertions of identity. So that's one mistake. And then the Marxism component also seems misapplied, because as I understand it, though I know even less about it, Marxism is about these underlying material conditions to which all the different identities would be subject, right? And so I think that he'd be saying, no, it's about the structure of the economic system, not about what race you are. all the different races are still wage slaves or whatever, So all of that just seems like another huge misunderstanding, and they're too busy playing a Michael Brooks style insult name game that they just come up with these words that they think sound like insults and throw them around. And that's, of course, I think mostly Peterson's fault, if I understand it right, that he started that and everyone else adopted it.
The cultural Marxism, I think, is what.
Yeah, that he may have gotten in part from the Stephen Hicks guy.
Yeah.
Whatever the genealogy of that is.
I think the Marxism thing is more telling maybe than the postmodern bit, because if you were to take that track, the political economic track, then it is sort of like, looks to me like a lot of people are saying, not a lot, but I mean, some people are saying, who take the somewhat leftist approach that Michael Brooks takes, that identity is just a tool of, the the neolibs that are in power, and they're just trying to divide people. And so that's kind of the hope, is to keep people not looking at like the inequality, the economic inequality or whatever, and to maintain their distrust of each other. And that's sort of like that seems to me like the main thrust when I hear someone like Peterson or whatever, these IDWs talks, Peterson in particular, this whole Marxism thing, and this protectionism around the status quo or whatever, the Pinker thing about how everything's getting better, and the idea that I think Jonathan Haidt likes to talk about groupism or whatever. Group, what does he call it? Something. He has a little twist on the word group, but yeah, that seems to me like it's all part of this attempt to maintain power. And one way to do that would be to um, cause everybody who may not have much power to fight each other about stuff. And right now it's like, you're in Columbus, Ohio, and Black Lives Matter protests are being intimidated by, some Harley Davidson type motorcycle gang, and they're all, white or whatever, versus a more mixed skin tone group in the Black Lives Matter or whatever. I don't know. I mean, that's sort of one spot that I think of when you mention that.
Yeah, that perspective makes a lot of sense to me also. I don't know if it's right. I wouldn't necessarily sign off on it, but it makes a lot of sense. This isn't my domain. Mostly, I don't care about this crap. This is all set, like, we don't do too much current event stuff on the Dawdlers, and like, we are mostly apolitical, and whatever. Yeah. But to just put into my words what I think the hypothesis that you're describing is that the real elites or whatever, the ones with the real money and power behind the scenes that we don't necessarily know so much about, either influence to have happen or pick up on its presence and do their best to amplify it. Any sort of intra-class competition, I think, if I'm using your terminology properly, amongst those of the non-elite. They're like, if we can make them fight amongst each other down there, none of them will come burn down our mansions on the golf course and redistribute our goods. If it's right that class is the primary life-altering distinction for most of us, rather than race, then they can just emphasize racial division, and then the poor white and the poor black, or whatever, if we can make them hate each other, they won't come after us. And that makes a lot of sense to me. It could totally be happening. I don't know if it is, if that's what's going on, but
that seems to be one of the almost self-organized and often referred to narratives or whatever at the time. I don't know how self-organized it is, but it sometimes seems like I get enough disparate sources that I wonder. Anyway, um, how did this relate to Bret Weinstein or Weinstein? Ah,
Oh, I don't know. I've just been talking about how, to me, he seems attitudinally priestly
yeah.
in the religion, quote unquote, analogously, the religion of science.
Hmm.
And I think that he would do better to sophisticate his epistemology, his philosophy of science, and his rhetoric such that it wasn't a tribalistic us versus them, science versus postmodernism, but rather, come join either us Dawdlers. I don't know if I should loop you in or not. Come join me in saying nobody knows what's true. There's no way to find out. But we do have a tool called argument and persuasion, and some arguments are better than others. And we can attempt to utilize the tools that we've developed, including science and rhetoric, which are both great. I'm in favor of them, to have more of it. But use them consciously and use them non-dogmatically and non-religiously to attempt to construct arguments, to communicate with one another, and make some progress toward better behaviors through said process. But if instead you've got one side that is asserting identity, very dogmatic thing to do, and another side that's asserting truth and reality, and there's one methodology to achieve it, all that, very dogmatic. You've got a couple of dogmatists, and all they can do is burn down each other's targets.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, like, we'll get to your thing when we get our shit together. But then you said it anyway, so like I just don't know, that sounds
Don't
great.
fight dogma with more dogma, damn it. Try to bring everybody into the realm of the maybe. And when you've got a bunch of people who are like, you are a racist, and I am a woman, and I am black, and I am white, and you are white, and it means this about you, and whatever, and all these high-level generalist abstractions that are all false.
I guess what I'm thinking is the approach that I would take is similar. Well, at least the concern starts with one of our mutual friends about the insane number of human beings on the planet right now, and the various kinds of resources that are available to everybody, and that there being only so much, and that might be a reason for why there is as much conflict to begin with, partly because of this nihilism or existentialism that we have, but also part of it could be also because of just other fears about not ever having enough and being caught up in this mode of existence where there is never enough. I mean, uh I would like to think that in order to get to the maybe, we got to like take care of the animals. We got to take care of the population size. Like we can't be this many. At least we should at least try and lower that number. And then once we've done that, maybe start to come up with other ways to spend our time rather than gobbling up everything as soon as it's available and trying to be, letting greedy people get a hold of the system and driving it in whatever direction, they think is going to work best for them. Um, that's stuff that once we do that, to me, I'm thinking, okay, then we can start to work towards Gene Roddenberry or whatever. But just, I, yeah, I just don't know. Like, that sounds great. It just seems like it's a big jump for people that are clawing in that mode, of clawing at each other. And things need to calm down. Then we can start to like think a little bit. But right now, nobody's thinking. There's no time for that. People like you get thrown off the train. They'll be like, "Fuck him. He's out. He's telling us to stop and think. You're gone. I've already got my mind made up." Or maybe we cook him and eat him. That would be the thing.
Yeah. Well, at least then they would be being efficient. That would be. I'm in favor of eating me rather than just throwing me off the Snowpiercer.
That's great. Yeah, it's Snowpiercer, exactly.
Yes, fine. I don't understand that. I'm not entirely sure that what you're saying is against me or whatever. I want population control. That's great. How would we ever make that happen if at least some who have power and influence start making better arguments first? You can't do population control first. You have to do
I mean, there'd probably be something else that came first before that even. Perhaps
like an asteroid or COVID or whatever.
Stuff like that might, also have an impact. If there's a lot of escape from the countryside to the cities, which it seems like there has been, maybe people start to do their own little grassroots, movements towards, rural communities or something like that. That seems to be another thing that people like to do. You mentioned Thaddeus Russell. He seems to have created his own little empire or whatever. Sometimes maybe that can just be done online. I don't know. I'm just saying that there's small ways that can be done, that can be made to, what am I trying to say? There's small things that can be done that lead up to, say, making decisions about population control. I don't know. I just don't have any faith that people would be able to just, shed all this stuff in one go. But maybe they could,
fine.
Maybe it's just
but
a
even
nice
if they don't, currently I'm just asking two people to do it. Just these Weinstein brothers, and they clearly are not suffering materially. Yeah. They've got more than they need, and yet they're still making the situation worse with the dogma games.
Well, they're suffering like existentially or something, right? That's why they have all this fucking dread and shit about the world, because they've devoted so much time to their understanding of the world or whatever it is, right? Maybe Eric will be able to do that, but he seems so invested in the political aspect of things and winning that fight. I don't know. I don't know.
There's just a huge difference between signing off from a podcast with the phrase, or some phrase that indicates, think about that, like, hey, everybody out there, I want you to think more, versus how Bret does it, stay strong. I think that is a disgusting sign off. That means me and all of my listeners, we know we're in this tribe. We know what's true. We're done. There's no thinking needed. What you need to do is keep thinking what you think now. Stay there. And
yes, totally. Stay strong.
There's no way. There. None of us know shit about anything. The pessimistic meta-induction argument from philosophy of science is so good and needs to be applied more. I don't see the flaw. Newton we now would say that Newton was wrong about almost everything, but in his day he was the smartest motherfucker around. Plato was wrong about everything, but he was the smartest one in his time, whatever. So yeah, Bret, even if your ego is right and you're the smartest person on earth right now, you're still probably wrong about everything. So don't stay strong. Keep thinking and try to move. And ask your audience to move. Like, motivate thinking. Don't motivate stasis. Anyway, Jimpy. Getting chimpy.
That's fine. I like it. Stay strong, everyone.
Yep. Hey, yeah, right. Segue. Podcast sign-offs. All right, we need to get the fuck out of here, right?
Sure.
Like, I have more important things to do. I have children and beds. Anyway,
Not important.
think. Just think, people. Got think.
Think more.
Think more.
Think more. Think more, people.